Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about what became of prisoners of war in the Middle Ages, how they were captured, ransomed, enslaved or slain, and how their fates mirrored the order and cruelty of our time. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honor, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. War in my time was not a ceaseless march of armies, but rather a rhythm set by the seasons. When the snows lay heavy and the earth hardened, men returned to their homes, for fields needed tending and supplies grew scarce. It was in the warmth of spring and summer that banners were raised, spears polished, and campaigns began anew. I recall the air buzzing with both dread and expectation, for each campaign brought uncertainty, whether a man would return to plough his land or lie forgotten in some foreign soil. Unlike the great hosts of later centuries, the forces that gathered were often small, yet each man carried immense weight upon the fate of the battle. Lords summoned their vassals, who in turn called upon peasants bound by duty. Mercenaries too, hardened by coin and blood, sold their skill to the highest bidder. Such armies bore little uniformity. Each man came with his own gear, his own strength, his own fears. What bound them was not shared training, but oaths of service and the hope of survival. Prisoners taken in such encounters were not countless. When armies clashed, only a fraction survived to fall captive. Yet those who did were shaped by their station in life. A knight, adorned with costly armor, might be spared for ransom, while the poor foot soldier, with only a pike in hand, was often granted no mercy. I saw this divide again and again, a harsh mirror of the very society we fought to defend. The rules of war, if they could be called such, were born less of morality than of practicality. To hold a man captive required resources, food, guards, and a place of confinement. Only those worth something to their families or lords were kept alive long enough to be bargained for. Thus, war was as much a harvest of coin as it was of land, and the captives became its crop. Seasons shaped the very nature of captivity. In the heat of a campaign, prisoners might be hastily executed to prevent rebellion or escape. But once battles ceased, survivors were more valuable as commodities of negotiation. The summer's chaos turned into winter's calculations, where messengers carried demands and treasurers tallied what could be paid. The cycle repeated year after year, as regular as the turning of the earth itself. I remember well how truces were arranged, sometimes as sudden as the wars themselves. On a frozen morning, word would arrive of an armistice, and swords were lowered as quickly as they had been drawn. Captives, too, felt this rhythm, one day fearing for their lives, the next awaiting exchange or ransom, their fates bound to parchment signed by lords far from the battlefield. It was a cruel gamble to live at the mercy of another's pen. When armies moved, they were like tides, retreating and advancing with equal force. To march with them was to feel the surge of human ambition and folly. Prisoners followed in their wake, tied, beaten, or carried along, symbols of both victory and burden. They were as much part of the spoils as the cattle taken from villages, yet they bore the heavier cost, for they embodied the fragility of man before power. Thus, the nature of war in those days was not endless conquest, but a cycle of eruption and silence. It dictated when lives would be lost, when chains would be fastened, and when gold would be demanded. To live as a knight was to know this rhythm intimately, and to see in the faces of prisoners not only the defeated enemy, but also the reflection of one's own possible fate, should fortune shift with the next sunrise. In the centuries after Rome crumbled, the ways of war belonged to tribes and their customs rather than to great empires. I walked among fields where battles were small, yet their cruelty left scars deeper than any empire's conquest. The victors did not always spare the defeated, for mercy was not expected. Captured men could be slain on the spot, or worse, bound and taken to serve as slaves in the homes and fields of their enemies. Such was the harsh simplicity of survival in those dark and fractured days. The Germanic peoples, Franks, Saxons, and Goths alike, carried traditions rooted in kinship and vengeance. To them, taking an enemy alive was not a matter of ransom, but of utility. A strong back might plough a field, or a nimble hand might serve a household. Those unfit for such toil often met the sword without hesitation. I recall hearing songs in the halls of warriors, where captives became the measure of a man's victory, trophies not of gold, but of flesh and bone. For women and children, captivity bore a different weight. They were rarely slain outright, but their lives became property, folded into the families of their captors or sold in distant markets. Some were married off against their will, others lived in servitude, their identities swallowed by the tribe that claimed them. Their existence became both survival and erasure, a reminder that war did not end with the battlefield, but echoed in homes and hearths long after the fighting ceased. These customs did not arise from cruelty alone, but from the absence of law beyond the clan. No king or council stood above to dictate justice. Power was local, and each tribe held to its own ancient codes. Among the Lombards and Saxons, blood feud and compensation in silver often replaced the sparing of lives. To capture an enemy was to hold leverage in that cycle, a bargaining piece for peace or revenge, depending on the will of leaders. Yet not all captives faced despair. Some were absorbed into the victor's ranks, given land or arms in exchange for loyalty. Warriors of fallen tribes could become the next generation's defenders under a new banner. I saw men who once faced each other with sword and shield later feast together as kin, the memory of enmity buried beneath necessity. Such assimilation was as practical as it was political, binding conquered peoples to the victors and swelling their strength. The absence of empires meant that fates varied wildly across the land. What one chieftain granted as clemency, another denied with the edge of his blade. In the forests of Germania, captives might toil in silence for years. On the plains of Francia, they might be slain to uphold honor. This patchwork of practices made survival as a prisoner uncertain, dictated not by uniform law, but by the whim of whoever held the sword. Slavery, though, was the constant that linked these scattered peoples. From the Baltic to the Mediterranean, the trade in human lives grew like shadowed vines across Europe. I remember markets where Slavic captives, so many that their very name gave birth to the word slave, were sold in droves, shipped to faraway lands. Their cries faded quickly beneath the clamour of coin, for profit spoke louder than pity. Thus, in those early centuries, the fate of a prisoner lay not in treaties or noble codes, but in the raw customs of tribe and chieftain. Some were bound into families, others reduced to servitude, and countless more cut down where they stood. The cruelty was not seen as cruelty then, but as the natural order of a fractured world. To survive those times was itself a triumph, whether in chains or in freedom. When the cross spread its shadow across Europe, the ways of dealing with captives began to change. Bishops and priests preached that every soul, even that of an enemy, bore the mark of God. I remember sermons delivered in cold stone churches, where the clergy urged rulers to ransom their foes rather than cut them down. Mercy was spoken of as a Christian duty, though I often saw the sword prove swifter than the gospel's call. Ideals were high, but men remained bound to blood and vengeance. The councils of the church gave voice to these ideals in decrees and canons. The Council of Arles in the 5th century condemned the killing of prisoners, and later voices from Rome reminded kings that sparing lives was a path to salvation. I witnessed scrolls read aloud in courts, yet warriors often listened with one ear while sharpening their blades with the other. The distance between parchment and practice was wide, but the seeds of compassion were nonetheless sown. Popes themselves entered the struggle for mercy. Gregory the Great, in the 6th century, urged Christians to ransom captives from the hands of pagan raiders, seeing in such acts the redemption of both captor and captive. The Church raised funds, sometimes selling its own treasures, to buy back Christians enslaved by enemies. I recall hearing of monks who travelled long roads with nothing but a sack of coin, their mission not conquest, but the buying of freedom for souls in chains. Still, war remained war, and in its heat the voice of the Church was often drowned. Soldiers driven by fear or fury rarely paused to think of doctrine when blood ran on the ground. I saw men slaughter captives despite the priest's warning, claiming necessity as their excuse. Others enslaved their foes while crossing themselves, believing that the balance of sin and salvation rested not in their deeds, but in the prayers offered afterward. Yet over time, the Church's counsel began to shape custom. Ransom became more common, and captives of noble birth were spared with the hope of payment. The very act of sparing an enemy came to be seen as a mark of Christian virtue, aligning with the knightly ideals that later blossomed into the code of chivalry. I felt the slow shift in the air, as though mercy, once rare, began to creep into the battlefield alongside cruelty. Monasteries often served as safe havens for captives. Behind their walls, men of violence placed their swords aside and left decisions to the abbot. Prisoners held there awaited ransom under the guard of prayer rather than iron. Some were even treated with kindness, offered bread and scripture to soften their captivity. Though far from universal, such places revealed how the faith sought to temper the iron laws of war with the gentleness of the gospel. The faithful also introduced rituals of release. On feast days, rulers sometimes freed captives to display their piety before God and men. I stood once in a square where shackled men were set loose during Easter, their chains unlocked as hymns rose into the sky. The act was as much display as devotion, but it showed how mercy became not only a virtue, but a means of power, binding rulers to the favor of the Church. Thus, though the path was neither swift nor straight, the influence of Christianity left its mark on the fate of the vanquished. The hand that once struck without pause began, at times, to hesitate. Lives that would have been forfeit found reprieve in ransom or release, and while cruelty never vanished from our wars, it found itself increasingly challenged by a higher call, the echo of a gospel that whispered of forgiveness, even in the din of steel. Power in my age flowed through bonds of land and loyalty, and war was no different. When nobles clashed, their captives were not merely men, but instruments of wealth and leverage. A lord taken in battle could fetch a fortune, his release secured by the lands he ruled, or the vassals sworn to him. I often marveled at how chains could turn into coin and how bloodshed transformed into negotiation once the fighting ended. Captivity itself became a reflection of the order that governed every corner of feudal life. The fate of a knight in captivity bore little resemblance to that of the peasant beside him. A knight's armor and lineage marked him as valuable, sparing him the edge of the sword. He might be confined within the walls of a castle, treated with a rough courtesy, until ransom was arranged. Meanwhile, the common archer or serf stood little chance of such consideration. Their lives were seen as expendable, their deaths scarcely noted in the chronicles of the time. This divide was not simply chance, but the very design of the system. Lords relied on the labor of peasants and the coin of merchants to secure the ransom of their kind. Villages were taxed heavily to free their overlords, for the loyalty of subjects demanded their sacrifice. I saw with my own eyes farmers give up their winter grain to pay for the release of a knight they had scarcely spoken to. To them, it was not choice, but duty, another burden in a life already bent low. Women of noble birth held special weight in this order. Taken in raids or sieges, they were rarely harmed outright, for their lineage could command high prices or political advantage. Hostages they became, pawns in the games of dynasties. I once heard of a countess kept in guarded chambers, treated with deference but stripped of freedom, her every gesture a bargaining tool for her captors. Her captivity was velvet-lined, yet no less a chain. Even monasteries and churches were entangled in these exchanges. Abbots negotiated ransoms, bishops demanded safe release for lords of their dioceses, and at times, holy relics were pawned to secure a captive's freedom. The hand of the divine was invoked often, but behind those words lay ledgers and sums, carefully tallied by stewards. The salvation of a soul could be measured in marks of silver or in acres of fertile land, as if eternity itself were weighed against earthly wealth. Not all who wore chains returned home. Some lingered for years if payment could not be gathered, their lives wasting away in towers. Others were forgotten entirely, their names fading as their families surrendered to poverty. I recall the hollow eyes of such men, nobles once proud, reduced to pleading for alms even as their titles were spoken in distant courts. Their imprisonment revealed the fragility of power, how swiftly fortune could unmake a man's estate. Meanwhile, those of lowly birth faced endings without ceremony. They were slain outright after battles to prevent them from rejoining the fray, or enslaved to toil on distant lands. Few chroniclers recorded their fates, yet their silence speaks volumes. The soil of Europe bears their memory more than parchment does, for it drank their blood and bore the weight of their labor long after their names were lost. Thus the feudal order, with its rigid lines of rank and wealth, shaped captivity as surely as it shaped life itself. Nobles lived to bargain for their freedom, peasants died forgotten in fields, and women became tokens in dynastic games. War did not erase these distinctions, it carved them deeper, etching inequality into the very bones of the age. And I, who stood among both the proud and the lowly, saw how captivity revealed the true face of our divided world. Gold often proved sharper than the sword, for in the wars of my time, the taking of captives became a trade in itself. To seize a nobleman was to strike a vein of wealth, more valuable than any plundered village. I remember knights on campaign who looked beyond the chaos of battle, their eyes searching for banners of high birth, for these men were worth far more alive than dead. Ransom grew into an art, a system as structured as any market. The arrangements were seldom hasty. Negotiations stretched across weeks or months, letters carried by messengers sealed with wax. Every demand weighed against the pride of families and kings. I have seen prisoners treated almost as guests, lodged in guarded halls, given food and wine, not from kindness, but because their well-being preserved their value. A noble corpse was useless, but a living captive could enrich generations. Thus, care became part of the bargain. Entire campaigns came to depend on this trade. Victorious captains financed new wars from the wealth of their captives, using the silver paid for one prisoner to equip armies for the next season. It was a cycle of blood and coin, where ransom not only spared lives, but also prolonged the conflicts that consumed them. To fight was to gamble, knowing that capture could bring ruin or fortune depending on which side of the chain you stood. Families bore the heaviest strain of these dealings. Wives pawned jewels, sons pressed serfs for greater dues, monasteries opened their treasuries, all to gather the sums demanded for a husband, a father, or a lord. The weight of one man's ransom often fell upon the backs of many, and I saw peasants starve while gold was piled for the freedom of those far above them. Mercy in ransom came often at the price of suffering for the poor. Even kings entered these calculations. Monarchs sometimes paid vast sums to redeem their nobles, for every captured lord represented not only wealth, but also loyalty and order in their realms. A kingdom weakened by prisoners risked rebellion and chaos, and so the crown itself became entangled in the bargaining. In truth, the ransom of the few was often the burden of the many, spreading hardship across entire realms. Not every prisoner was fortunate enough to be freed. Some ransoms grew so high that they could never be met, and captives languished for years. their lives spent in confinement as leverage that no one could afford to resolve. I once met a knight who had aged into frailty behind stone walls, his ransom set beyond the reach of his kin. His chains were not iron alone, but the weight of a debt that could never be lifted. The practice also fueled treachery. Men were sometimes taken not on the field of battle, but through betrayal, ambushed or captured by those who sought profit rather than honor. War blurred with banditry, and noble names became commodities in the ruthless market of ransom. I learned to guard my steps, not only against the spear of an enemy, but against the grasping hand of one who saw me as coin to be counted. Thus ransom, born of mercy's call, became instead the lifeblood of warfare. It enriched victors, impoverished families, and reshaped the very purpose of combat. To capture a man was often more sought after than to kill him, and in this pursuit, war became not only a matter of blood and glory, but of balance sheets and ledgers, a grim business conducted in the name of survival and gain. There are names that echo through stone halls and campfires alike, and Richard of England is one such name. When he returned from the Crusades in 1192, fortune betrayed him. Captured first by Duke Leopold of Austria, and then handed to Emperor Henry VI, his captivity shook Christendom. I recall how the tale spread like wildfire across Europe, not just of a king held in chains, but of the staggering price demanded for his release. It was a sum that weighed heavier than swords ever could. The ransom fixed upon him was 150,000 marks, a treasure so vast that chroniclers compared it to draining the veins of a kingdom. To understand its measure, know that it equaled several years of England's total income. Monasteries stripped their silver, nobles emptied coffers, and commoners bore taxes beyond endurance. I can still imagine the grief of peasants who gave their last coins to free a monarch they had never seen, bound by the invisible tether of loyalty to crown and cross. Richard's imprisonment was not of iron bars alone, but of politics. Leopold sought vengeance for slights received during the Crusade, while Henry saw the chance to enrich both his empire and his prestige. The King of France, Philip Augustus, whispered in delight at his rival's downfall, seizing English lands in Richard's absence. Thus one man's captivity altered the course of kingdoms, showing how chains upon a single figure could ripple across all Europe. The negotiations themselves were labyrinthine. Envoys rode day and night, letters sealed with wax crossed mountains and rivers, each carrying promises, threats, or pleas. Behind every word lay urgency, for the longer Richard remained captive, the weaker England grew. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, fierce and determined even in her age, marshalled every resource she could find, proving how the will of one woman held an empire together while its king lay bound. At last, the silver began to flow, coins minted, plate melted, treasures pawned. Shiploads of ransom crossed borders under heavy guard, for robbers and rival lords salivated at the wealth passing through their lands. It was as if the whole of Christendom became aware that power itself had been transformed into coin, that a monarch's freedom could be purchased as though he were any common knight. In that exchange, the value of kingship itself was both diminished and magnified. Richard's return was not triumph alone. Though freed in 1194, England bore the scars of his captivity. The ransom left debts that weighed for decades, emptying treasuries and increasing burdens upon the poor. Some said that while the king walked free, his people remained chained to the debt of his release. It revealed with cruel clarity how the captivity of rulers often cost more than their absence from the throne. Yet his case also became legend, shaping how warlords and monarchs viewed prisoners thereafter. To hold a ruler was to command not just his lands, but his people, to turn the fate of kingdoms into bargaining chips. From that time on, kings and nobles alike travelled in fear of ambush, knowing that capture could become a throne's undoing. Richard's chains rang long after they were struck off, a warning to all who bore crowns. And so his story lingers in my mind as the purest example of ransom's double edge. It spared his life, but drained his realm. It freed a king, but burdened his people. It proved that captivity was not only the sorrow of the chained, but also of the countless unseen who bore the cost. His ordeal was not an exception, but a mirror, showing to all of Europe that in our age, freedom and fortune were bound together by iron and silver alike. Among all the faces I saw on the field, none were more forgotten than the humble footmen. They bore pikes, bows, and rusted blades, marching under the banners of lords who scarcely remembered their names. When such men were taken alive, their worth was judged as nothing. Unlike knights, they had no ransom to offer, no land to pledge, no lineage to defend. Their lives were measured in the smallest coin, and often not measured at all. I recall after battles how heaps of prisoners stood in terror, stripped of their arms, their fate hanging by the whim of victors. For nobles, mercy meant negotiation, but for peasants, it often meant death or bondage. I witnessed entire groups of archers put to the sword, not from cruelty alone, but because their captors feared they might rise again if released. Their existence was seen as a threat, and so they were erased before they could once more lift bow or spear. Some were sold into slavery, their bodies exchanged in markets across Europe or shipped to foreign shores. In the Mediterranean, captives could find themselves rowing in galleys, chained to benches until their strength was spent. Others were set to work in fields or mines, their toil feeding the wealth of lords far removed from battle. To be captured as a common soldier was not to await ransom, but to be absorbed into a world where survival was bought by endless labor. There were rare moments when fortune turned kinder. At times, captors spared peasants simply because to kill them served no purpose, and labor was needed to rebuild plundered lands. I once saw a village spared slaughter because its men agreed to till the conqueror's fields. In such bargains, the line between prisoner and servant blurred, their freedom exchanged for a harvest that would never be theirs. Yet even this mercy was bound by necessity, not compassion. The chronicles of the age seldom recorded these fates. Scribes filled their parchment with tales of captured kings and noble knights, but the countless nameless soldiers vanished into silence. Their deaths left no songs, their chains no chronicles. It was the soil itself that remembered them, worked by their hands or soaked with their blood, while history turned its gaze to the high-born, whose captivity stirred courts and kingdoms. This neglect did not pass unnoticed by those who fought. Common men knew that their lives mattered little to their lords. They marched because they were compelled, and they fought with the quiet knowledge that, if seized, no one would ransom them. I remember the eyes of such men, resigned yet fierce, as though they carried within them the weight of being both essential and expendable. Their courage was born not of reward, but of necessity. In sieges, the treatment grew harsher still. When a castle fell, its defenders who lacked noble blood were often slaughtered to set an example. The victors claimed it was justice, but it was fear they sowed, to warn others not to resist. I once walked through a courtyard where dozens lay still, and the silence of their sacrifice echoed louder than any trumpet. Such was the brutal arithmetic of war, where the many bore the suffering to magnify the triumph of the few. Thus, the story of common soldiers in captivity is one of shadows. They were the backbone of armies, yet the most disposable when chains were clasped. Their lives filled the gaps between kings and chronicles, sustaining wars they would never profit from. And though their names are lost, their fate reminds me that the weight of history rests not only on thrones, but also on the countless forgotten who bled and bowed unseen. Long before the word freedom carried weight among common men, captivity often meant a life in chains. Those taken in war were not always slain. Many were bound into servitude, their bodies turned into currency for their conquerors. I have walked past markets where the cries of the defeated rose not in defiance, but in despair, as they were sold like cattle to strangers. To be a prisoner was to become a tool, an ox for the fields, a hand for the plough, a back bent beneath another's burden. The Viking raids left deep scars across Europe in this regard. From the coasts of Ireland to the rivers of Francia, countless men and women were carried away in ships, their fate sealed far from the land of their birth. I heard tales of English villagers dragged to markets in Scandinavia, their children growing up speaking the tongue of their captors. The Northmen saw no shame in this trade. To them, it was profit, as natural as plunder. In the south, across the Mediterranean, the practice was no less fierce. Wars between Christian and Muslim realms fed an insatiable demand for human labour. Captives taken in raids on Sicily or along the Iberian coast might find themselves in the markets of North Africa or the cities of the Levant. Likewise, Saracen prisoners were sold in Christian lands, their lives bartered for gold. The traffic in human beings tied our continents together as cruelly as any chain. Agricultural toil was the fate of many. I recall villages where prisoners were driven to till the soil of their enemies, planting and reaping harvests they would never taste. They slept in huts, guarded by armed men, their lives bound to the rhythm of seasons not their own. Some toiled in vineyards, others in fields of wheat, their labour enriching the lords who had stripped them of both land and liberty. Others were sent to harsher fate still, condemned to mines where daylight rarely pierced the gloom. In those pits, men dug for salt, silver, or iron, their bodies wasting quickly under the strain. Few survived long in such places, and fewer still escaped. I once met a friar who told me he prayed for those souls daily, believing that their suffering echoed the trials of martyrs. Yet prayers did little to ease the weight of the stones they carried. Domestic service claimed another portion of captives. Women especially were drawn into noble households, made to serve at tables, tend to chambers, or nurse children not their own. Though spared the sword, they lived under constant subjugation, their identities stripped away as thoroughly as their freedom. I recall hearing of noble ladies boasting of the number of servants taken in war, as though the humiliation of enemies was itself a badge of victory. Some captives endured the fate of being traded across borders, sold multiple times until their origins were nothing but memory. A man born in Gaul might die in Africa, his name forgotten in the shuffle of markets. This dispersal scattered countless lives, weaving them into lands where they had no kin. They became invisible threads in the fabric of foreign societies, their voices lost beneath the weight of conquest. So it was that war created not only graves, but chains. The conquered did not always die on the field. Many lived on as shadows of themselves, enslaved in homes, farms, and markets that thrived upon their misery. Their bondage was not an accident of war, but one of its purposes, for the hunger for labour and wealth was as endless as the hunger for victory. And I, who saw the sorrow in their eyes, knew captivity's cruelty often lay not in death, but in the living that followed it. Much was spoken in my age of honour and the knightly code, though the clash between word and deed was plain to all who bore arms. Chivalry urged mercy toward the defeated, teaching that a noble foe deserved ransom and respect. I heard troubadours sing of knights who spared enemies in shining acts of virtue, their songs carrying ideals that stirred hearts. Yet on the battlefield, blood and fear often smothered such lofty visions, leaving mercy as a rare guest among us. Knights of high birth often treated captured peers with a rough courtesy. A noble taken prisoner might dine with his captor, awaiting ransom in guarded comfort, his life spared not by compassion but by calculation. This practice was cloaked in the language of honour, but it was coin that safeguarded his survival. In this, the code of chivalry aligned well with the needs of wealth and war, making mercy profitable rather than selfless. The code, however, did not extend evenly across society. Common soldiers, lacking titles or wealth, fell outside the shield of chivalric mercy. I remember men cut down where they stood, their cries unheard amid the trumpets of victory. Chivalry praised the nobility of sparing equals, but it turned its face from peasants and bowmen as though their lives bore no worth. In truth, the code revealed less of universal justice and more of social rank. Still, chivalry carried weight in shaping expectation. Knights strove to be remembered not only as warriors, but as men of virtue. Chronicles praised those who treated prisoners with restraint, raising their names to enduring honor. I once read a scribe's account of a knight who freed a captured foe without ransom, and his name was lauded more than the victories of many others. Such gestures, though rare, planted seeds of admiration that lingered long after blood dried. Religious influence entwined with this ideal. Priests reminded knights that Christ himself urged mercy, and sparing prisoners was seen as a mark of Christian virtue. To grant life could be as holy as winning a battle, for the soul was valued above the sword. Yet temptation to slaughter remained, especially when fear of revolt or shortage of provisions pressed heavily upon commanders. Chivalry might counsel patience, but necessity often sharpened the blade. I saw too how the code created rivalry among knights, each striving to outshine the other in acts of supposed nobility. Some spared enemies with flourish, announcing their virtue loudly so that all might witness. Others gave their prisoners generous treatment, hoping their deeds would be immortalized in song. Whether born of true mercy or vanity, these gestures shaped how the age remembered them, binding reputation as tightly as chains bound their captives. There were times when chivalry failed entirely. In the heat of siege, or the aftermath of a crushing victory, no code restrained the slaughter of low-born defenders. Even knights were not always spared if their captors bore grudges too deep. I once stood at the edge of a field where promises of mercy had been broken and the ground was littered with the betrayed. In such moments, the songs of chivalry fell silent, drowned by steel and ash. Thus, the role of chivalry in captivity was both beacon and illusion. It offered a vision of mercy that inspired some and deceived many, holding aloft ideals often betrayed by necessity and greed. Yet even in its imperfection, it left an imprint upon our memory, reminding us that war need not always consume all humanity. Though unevenly applied, it whispered of a higher path, one that flickered like a candle in the storm of battle. To speak of imprisonment in my time is to speak of contrasts as stark as night and day. Castles and towers served as the holding places for the captured, yet the treatment inside their walls depended not on justice, but on rank. I have seen noble prisoners given chambers with hearths and attendants, their captivity softened by privilege. At the same time, I have walked past dungeons where common men wasted away in darkness, their chains heavier than their crimes. The place mattered less than the worth of the one confined. Nobles awaiting ransom were often held in relative comfort. They might stroll in courtyards under guard, partake in meals of bread and meat, and even write letters to their kin. Their captivity was not meant to destroy them, but to preserve their value until gold was exchanged. I recall hearing of knights who spoke fondly of their confinement years later, describing it almost as an extended stay in another lord's hall. Yet even in these cases, freedom's absence weighed heavily. For those of low station, the story was far grimmer. Common soldiers and peasants were crammed into damp cells, where straw rotted beneath them and air grew foul with disease. Hunger gnawed at their bodies, and illness spread quickly in such confines. Few who entered such places emerged alive, for they were given neither ransom nor hope. I once peered into such a pit, and the silence of the captives was broken only by the rattle of chains and shallow breaths. Some fortresses grew notorious for their treatment of prisoners. The Tower of London held nobles whose presence was as much a statement of royal power as it was a means of restraint. To keep a man visible yet caged was to remind all of the crown's authority. In France, Château Gaillard rose as another such site, its stones carrying the weight of both grandeur and despair. These places became symbols, where captivity spoke louder than liberty. The church, too, played its role. Monasteries sometimes served as prisons for noble captives, cloaked in piety, yet still instruments of control. Within cloisters, A prisoner might hear chants of monks as the days passed, his freedom measured by prayers and negotiations beyond his reach. Though less harsh than dungeons, such confinements bore their own torment, the slow erosion of will beneath the rhythm of bells. Mercy, if present, was tempered by the chains of obligation. It must be remembered that long-term prisons, as later ages knew them, were rare. Incarceration was not an end in itself, but a pause, a holding ground, until ransom, execution, or enslavement decided the fate of the captive. Cells were not built for rehabilitation, but for containment, their purpose as temporary as the parchment contracts they awaited. This uncertainty gnawed at the mind, for a man might wait weeks or years without knowing whether he would ever walk free again. The architecture itself betrayed the truth of these places. Narrow slits of light, thick doors of oak, and iron rings fastened to stone made clear that escape was folly. I once traced my hand along the cold walls of such a chamber and felt how they seemed to drink in despair. Time moved differently in such confinement, hours stretching endlessly while the world outside turned its seasons without regard. A prisoner's world was reduced to stone, shadow, and silence. In the end, the conditions of captivity revealed the nature of the age. Nobles lived in guarded halls, sustained by their worth, while the poor rotted unseen in pits of filth. To walk through such places was to glimpse the hierarchy of our world laid bare, written not in words but in the suffering and survival of men. And though some captives endured with dignity, the walls around them whispered of a truth none could deny, that in our time, freedom was a privilege, not a right. The holy wars that swept from Europe to the Levant carried with them not only swords, but chains. On those burning fields, Christians and Muslims alike waged battle, and the fate of captives became a reflection of both vengeance and faith. I remember hearing of men who fought beneath the cross, taken prisoner by the crescent, and of Muslims bound by crusaders and marched westward. Captivity during those wars revealed the fierce clash of cultures, each side certain of divine favor. Treatment of prisoners shifted with the tide of war. After victories, there were moments when captives were ransomed honorably, exchanged through careful negotiation. At other times, massacres stained the soil red, leaving no room for mercy. In Antioch, in Acre, in countless sieges, the decision to spare or to slaughter was made not by codes alone, but by hunger, fear, and wrath. The fate of captives swung between extremes, as unpredictable as the battles themselves. I recall accounts of prisoner exchanges, where men in chains crossed paths on dusty roads, heading in opposite directions toward freedom. These moments, though rare, carried a strange dignity, as though both sides recognized a shared humanity amid their hatred. Gold, goods, or even sacred relics were bartered in these exchanges, and the lives of warriors became pieces in a larger game of faith and politics. For some, such transactions were their only salvation. But there were darker tales that spread across Europe, stories of captives who endured unspeakable trials. Some crusaders, when taken by Muslim forces, were forced into hard labor or pressed into service under watchful eyes. Others found themselves sold in distant markets, vanishing into lands far from their homes. Likewise, Muslim prisoners carried off by Christians suffered enslavement, their lives uprooted as they were scattered across European lands. Both sides bore the weight of cruelty, neither free from guilt. The justifications for such actions were often wrapped in sacred words. Christians claimed the defense of the Holy Sepulchre, Muslims the defense of their own holy lands. To slaughter or enslave prisoners was painted as God's will, and thus consciences were soothed even as blood flowed. I saw how belief gave cover to deeds that might otherwise have been condemned, turning captivity into a matter not of law, but of faith. Noble captives carried unique importance in these wars. The capture of lords or princes could sway entire campaigns, for their ransom provided wealth or secured truces. Saladin himself, famed for his victories, was known at times to grant mercy to noble prisoners, enhancing his reputation for honor even while striking fear through conquest. Such gestures, though rare, lingered in memory as proof that even in holy war, a spark of restraint could shine through the smoke. Yet for common soldiers, the cross or crescent offered little protection. They were slaughtered in droves after battles, seen as obstacles rather than bargaining tools. Their deaths were often swift, their bodies left to the dust, while chronicles praised the sparing of lords and knights. In the eyes of the age, the blood of the poor weighed little, and their captivity, when it came, was more often slavery than ransom. Their fates whispered of the divide that ruled the medieval world. Thus, the Crusades carved captivity into stark relief. On those faraway fields, men were reminded that mercy was fragile, easily lost in the fire of zeal. Some found freedom through ransom or exchange, others perished beneath blades, and countless more were swallowed by slavery. To fight in those wars was to gamble not only with life, but with the manner of one's bondage, and the echoes of those choices still linger in the stones of Jerusalem and the sands of Acre. When I think upon the weight of cruelty, my mind turns to the summer of 1099, when Crusaders breached the walls of Jerusalem. The city, sacred to three faiths, became a furnace of blood as the victors swept through its streets. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, whether armed or defenseless, faced a storm that showed little mercy. I have heard the chronicles speak of rivers of blood flowing in the temple precinct, and though words often exaggerate, the scale of death left no doubt of its horror. Captives in that city found little hope of ransom or reprieve. Unlike in battles where wealth softened the fate of prisoners, here fervour and zeal smothered calculation. Men who might have been spared for coin were cut down in vengeance, their faith marking them for death. Women and children, too, were struck without hesitation, their cries rising into the air alongside the chants of victors praising God. The sword silenced countless lives that day, as though heaven's will was claimed through slaughter. Chroniclers from both sides preserved the memory. Fulcher of Chartres, a crusader, wrote of triumphant victory, while Muslim historians described grief that burned through generations. To some, it was a conquest ordained by God. To others, it was a desecration of the very holy ground both sides claimed to honor. I have read those words, and in them lies the unbearable tension of the age, devotion to the divine used to justify acts no faith should bear. The massacre also revealed the limits of chivalry and ransom when faith was at stake. In Europe, a nobleman's life might be spared for silver, but in Jerusalem, faith itself became the dividing line. To wear the crescent or to worship in a synagogue marked one for death regardless of station. The slaughter proved that in moments of fervour, all codes could be abandoned, and the worth of a life reduced to the prayers whispered on one's lips. Yet even amid such ruin, some accounts tell of isolated mercy. A handful of captives were spared, either hidden by neighbours or taken by crusaders who saw value in keeping them alive. These few survivors stand out, not because they were common, but because they were exceptions. Their survival shines like sparks in ash, reminders that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual choices still mattered. Still, the scale of mercy was a droplet in an ocean of death. The consequences of that day reached far beyond the city walls. News of the slaughter spread swiftly, hardening resolve among Muslim leaders and fueling vows of vengeance. The Crusaders' triumph became their curse, for the brutality ensured that reconciliation was made impossible. Each child orphaned, each family destroyed, became a seed of bitterness that would bear fruit in wars for generations to come. Jerusalem's conquest was not an end, but the beginning of further strife. For the Crusaders, the massacre was cloaked in sanctity. Pilgrims bathed in victory, believing themselves instruments of divine will. They purified their swords in blood, then prayed in the church of the Holy Sepulchre, as though their deeds were absolved by worship. I cannot forget how those two images live side by side. Men kneeling in reverence, with blood still wet on their hands. It is a contradiction that lingers heavy upon the memory of our age. Thus, the fall of Jerusalem stands as a wound upon history. It showed how devotion, when entangled with conquest, could unleash fury without restraint. Captivity was abandoned for extermination, and mercy gave way to zeal. The city was taken, but at a cost that darkened the very triumph the Crusaders claimed. And as the centuries unfolded, the stones of Jerusalem bore silent witness to the truth that holy war spares neither the body nor the soul. Across the long centuries of struggle in Iberia, captivity became as common as the clash of swords. Christians and Muslims, locked in an unending contest for land and faith, captured one another by the thousands. I recall hearing tales of border raids where villages were emptied overnight, their inhabitants led away as spoils of war. These captives filled prisons, markets, and households, their fates decided not by justice, but by who held power that season. The struggle was not only for territory, but for the very lives of those seized. Ransom stood at the heart of this contest. Wealthy knights and nobles were often kept alive, their release negotiated through gold or political promises. I remember reading of Christian orders like the Mercedarians, who dedicated themselves to gathering funds to redeem fellow believers from Muslim captivity. The exchange worked both ways, for Muslim leaders too ransomed their captured kin from Christian hands. Thus, beneath the endless battles, a strange economy of mercy and coin flourished. Not all were so fortunate. The common folk, farmers, shepherds, artisans, were less likely to see freedom once seized. Many were sold into slavery, dispersed into distant lands where their tongues and customs vanished into the air. I once heard of entire villages carried into North Africa, their names erased, their stories ending in silence. For them, captivity was not a pause, but a life sentence, their chains stretching across generations. The frontier regions were especially cruel. Raids by Christian and Muslim forces alike sought not merely to conquer, but to depopulate, to weaken the enemy by robbing them of their people. These captives filled the markets of Córdoba, Seville, and Valencia, or crossed the seas to find themselves in Algiers and Tunis. Families were torn apart, children separated from parents, husbands from wives. Such sorrow became part of the very rhythm of life on the frontier. Even noblewomen were caught in this tide. When captured, they might be treated with deference, held as hostages for ransom, or leverage in negotiations. Yet women without rank often endured harsher fates, forced into servitude or taken as concubines. Chronicles from both sides speak of the anguish of mothers whose children vanished into foreign lands, raised in faiths not their own. Such accounts remind us that captivity struck at the heart of families as much as it did armies. Religious orders dedicated themselves to easing this suffering. The Mercedarians, and later the Trinitarians, raised funds and sailed into enemy ports to buy back captives. I recall stories of friars who offered themselves in exchange when money was not enough, living in bondage so others might walk free. These acts of sacrifice stood in stark contrast to the cruelty of the wars, rays of compassion piercing the darkness of endless struggle. The scale of captivity left its mark upon both societies. Wealth flowed through the ransoms paid, shaping economies and draining treasuries. Some rulers taxed their people heavily to redeem captives, while others profited from the sale of their foes. The exchange of lives became as routine as the exchange of goods, and war itself grew tied to the market of human suffering. In this way, the Reconquista was fought as much in chains as in steel. Thus, in the long wars of Spain, captivity became both weapon and livelihood. It revealed the cruelty of an age where faith and conquest intertwined, but also moments of sacrifice where compassion resisted the tide. For every noble redeemed in splendor, countless commoners vanished into bondage. Their voices are faint now, but the stones of Iberia and the waves of the Mediterranean still carry the memory of those who lived and died, as prisoners in a war without end. Upon the waters, war bore a face no less cruel than on land. Naval battles, whether in the north where Viking ships cut through mist, or in the south where galleys clashed beneath the sun, yielded hosts of captives. Men seized at sea were not merely warriors. They were sailors, merchants, and fishermen swept into conflict by fortune's tide. I recall hearing of ships taken whole, their crews chained before the mast, their lives sold for silver before their wounds could heal. The sea gave no quarter, and neither did those who ruled it. The Vikings, fierce and cunning, carried countless souls away from the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and Francia. Their longships bore not only plundered gold, but also men, women, and children destined for servitude. In the markets of Dublin, captives stood in rows, their fates bartered as if they were sacks of grain. I once listened to a monk describe how entire monasteries were emptied. The brethren carried northward, their chants silenced forever. To the Norse raiders, human lives were cargo, valued for labor and profit. In the Mediterranean, corsairs turned the sea lanes into hunting grounds. Christian and Muslim sailors alike seized ships, their captives feeding a trade that stretched across continents. Genoese, Venetian, and Catalan merchants grew wealthy in part from this human commerce, for markets demanded a steady flow of labor. In Tunis, Algiers, and Alexandria, Christian captives were sold, while in Barcelona or Pisa, Muslim prisoners were shackled and displayed. The sea was a bridge for faith and trade, but also for bondage. To be taken at sea often meant years of servitude at the oar. Galleys required endless muscle, and prisoners were chained to benches, forced to row under whip and sun. I have heard men speak of the despair of hearing the drumbeat that set their strokes, knowing each beat bound them to toil without end. Death came quickly to those who faltered, and their bodies were cast into the waters that had borne them into captivity. Few fates were harsher than the galley slave. Ransom remained possible for those of noble blood. Captains and merchants of renown might see their families gather coin to buy them back, and in rare cases, entire shiploads of prisoners were exchanged. But for the nameless sailor or the poor fisherman, ransom was a dream that never came. Their lives ended in obscurity, their bones left in foreign soil or at the bottom of the sea, remembered only by the widows and children who waited in vain for their return. The Church once more played its part, for orders such as the Trinitarians devoted themselves to ransoming captives from Muslim lands. Their ships crossed the waters not with swords, but with purses, buying back Christians and bringing them home. Yet even their efforts could not stem the tide of captivity, for the sea never ceased to claim new victims. The scale of this suffering outpaced mercy, leaving countless lives forever bound across hostile shores. Maritime warfare also blurred the line between piracy and holy struggle. A corsair might raise the banner of faith, claiming his captives in God's name, but his purpose was wealth. In truth, the sea made every man a prize, every ship a gamble. Those who ruled the waves claimed dominion not only over trade, but over human flesh. And so, the waters of the Mediterranean and the North alike became vast graveyards of freedom. Thus, the sea revealed its own cruelty in war. Armies on land fought for castles and fields, but navies fought for ships, cargo, and the bodies of men. Captivity at sea was swift, merciless, and often endless, scattering captives across horizons far from their homes. I think of the ocean now as both highway and prison, carrying not only merchants and pilgrims, but the cries of those who vanished into chains with the crash of waves as their witness. The Normans, born of Viking blood yet tempered by Frankish soil, waged war with a pragmatism that left no room for sentiment. When they swept into England, Sicily, and beyond, captives became as much a resource as land itself. I have walked through their camps where prisoners sat in silence, waiting for their fates to be weighed. Some were spared for ransom, others enslaved, and still more put to death when they offered no value. Their logic was cold but consistent, binding mercy to profit In England, after Hastings in 1066, the treatment of captives revealed this dual nature. Noble Saxons taken in battle were held for ransom, enriching Norman lords while securing submission. Yet the common defenders of villages and burghs found no such bargain. Their lands were seized, their families displaced, their resistance broken through fear. The conquest was written not only in blood, but in chains, as thousands learned that survival itself could be turned into currency. In southern Italy and Sicily, the Normans displayed the same ruthless calculation. They encountered Byzantines and Muslims, and in each case they weighed captives by their worth. Nobles were held carefully, often in guarded towers, awaiting ransom that would finance further campaigns. Meanwhile, ordinary soldiers, when not slaughtered outright, were enslaved to work in fields or serve as auxiliaries. Their labor sustained the very conquest that had stripped them of freedom. The siege of Bari in 1071, when the Normans wrested the city from Byzantine rule, showed this starkly. Prisoners were sorted like goods in a market. Officers and nobles kept alive for ransom. Civilians enslaved or driven out. Soldiers slain if they resisted. The act was not unusual for the time, but the efficiency with which the Normans practiced it marked their reputation. They were conquerors who measured men as carefully as they measured gold. Women and children, too, were swept into their grasp. Noble women could be exchanged for great sums or political advantage, while others were taken into households as servants or hostages. Children of prominent families became pawns in negotiations, raised under watchful eyes until terms were fulfilled. The Normans understood that captivity could bind alliances as strongly as marriage, and so they used hostages as living guarantees of treaties and oaths. Religion added yet another layer. In their wars against Muslims in Sicily, the Normans cast their victories as holy, yet still they sold captives into slavery when it profited them. Piety and pragmatism walked side by side, each serving the other. I have heard monks praise Norman lords for donating ransom earnings to monasteries, even as those same lords sold common prisoners to distant markets. Such contradictions defined the age, cloaking commerce in the language of faith. Their castles across Europe bore silent witness to these practices. Within thick walls, prisoners of rank dined in guarded chambers, while peasants languished in dark cellars. The disparity mirrored the feudal world the Normans strengthened, where chains weighed differently depending on one's birth. To stand in a Norman stronghold was to see captivity woven into its very stones, part of both defense and display of power. Thus the Normans, like others of their time, balanced cruelty and calculation. Yet they did so with a precision that made captivity a weapon of conquest, a tool of governance, and a source of wealth. Their rise was built not only on victory in battle, but on the careful management of those they subdued. And so, wherever their banners flew, from the White Tower of London to the palaces of Palermo, prisoners became part of the fabric of Norman rule. War spared no one, and in its path, women and children often bore chains alongside men. When noble families fell into enemy hands, daughters and wives became hostages, their lives bargaining pieces in the politics of conquest. I remember hearing of countesses and princesses confined in guarded halls, treated with courtesy, but stripped of freedom. Their worth lay not in labor or ransom alone, but in the leverage they gave to those who held them. Such captivity carried a gentler face, yet it was captivity nonetheless. Among the nobility, women were sometimes exchanged for vast sums or political concessions. Marriages were arranged through their captivity, binding houses together by force rather than love. A lady of rank could see her fate tied to treaties she had no voice in shaping, her life redirected by the ambitions of men. Children of noble birth suffered the same, used as pawns to secure truces or peace agreements. To live as a hostage was to embody the fragile trust between enemies. Outside the courts and castles, the story grew harsher. Non-noble women seized in raids or sieges were rarely spared. Many were sold into slavery, forced to serve in homes, fields, or markets far from their kin. Some were taken as concubines, their bodies treated as the spoils of war, their voices silenced beneath the weight of conquest. I have seen chronicles where their names were never written, their suffering lost to time, yet their absence spoke loudly in the ruins they left behind. Children too were caught in this tide of misfortune. Young boys, if strong enough, were set to toil in fields or trained for labor, while young girls often vanished into domestic servitude. In frontier lands, especially during the Reconquista or Viking raids, entire villages of children were carried off, growing to adulthood in lands foreign to their birth. They became part of the fabric of their captors' societies, their original lives erased as though they had never been. In some cases, captors sought to reshape these children through faith. Christian children taken by Muslims, or Muslim children taken by Christians, might be raised in the religion of their captors. They grew up speaking a new tongue, praying at new altars, their identities forged anew by force. I once heard a monk say that to redeem a captive child was to redeem an entire soul, yet few had the means to rescue them. Their lives were reshaped by powers beyond their grasp. The weight of this practice pressed heavily upon families left behind. Mothers mourned children they might never see again. Fathers gave everything to redeem wives held captive. Villages gathered offerings to ransom neighbors, but often the sums demanded were far beyond reach. I recall hearing of communities ruined not by the sword, but by the coin they could not pay to rescue their own. Captivity shattered more than bodies. It fractured families, tearing bonds of kinship as cruelly as any blade. At times, captors displayed their hostages as symbols of dominance. A noblewoman seated at her captor's table was a silent reminder of victory, her presence an unspoken warning to her kin. Children held in castles stood as living guarantees that treaties would be honored. Their captivity was both spectacle and strategy, reinforcing the power of the conqueror while keeping rebellion at bay. Chains were not always of iron. Sometimes they were woven from fear and the sight of loved ones confined. So it was that women and children bore captivity in ways both subtle and brutal. For some, it meant political confinement in guarded chambers. For others, it meant slavery, exile, and erasure. Their suffering often went unrecorded in chronicles that praised knights and kings, yet their silence forms part of the true story of war. To remember them is to see beyond battles and banners, to the quiet tragedies that shaped households and haunted generations. Across the centuries of conflict, I saw how peace itself was rarely trusted without a guarantee. That guarantee often came in the form of living hostages, sons, daughters, and kin of rulers handed over to seal the promises of treaties. Kings and lords sent their own blood into the custody of their rivals, believing that only the presence of a loved one in enemy hands could keep words from breaking. Hostages became the flesh and blood anchors of fragile truces. Children of noble birth were the most common given in such exchanges. Princes were raised in foreign courts, their lives both pledge and warning. I remember reading of the sons of Scottish and Welsh lords sent into English hands, growing up beneath the shadow of their captors' castles. These youths lived lives of paradox, treated with courtesy as noble guests, yet always reminded that their safety depended on the obedience of their fathers. They were pawns cloaked in velvet. Daughters, too, were offered as guarantees. Though sometimes destined for marriage to cement alliances, many were simply kept as hostages, their futures held in suspense until peace was proven secure. I recall hearing of noble maidens confined in monasteries under guard, their lives suspended as tokens of loyalty. They were not treated with cruelty, but neither did they hold their own destinies. Every letter from home, every shift in politics, carried the weight of their fate. Treatment of hostages varied widely. Some lived in near luxury, partaking in the education of their captors' court, learning languages, manners, and arts they might never have known otherwise. For a few, captivity became a strange kind of opportunity, yet always there lingered the dread that if their kin broke faith, their lives could end abruptly. The sword that did not strike them on the battlefield hung invisibly above their heads in every hall they walked. The presence of hostages often shaped politics as much as treaties themselves. A ruler who held the son of his enemy possessed not only leverage but also influence. Many hostages grew attached to their captors, creating ties of loyalty that complicated future wars. I heard of young nobles who returned home years later, speaking the tongue of their captors and carrying sympathies that unsettled their own people. Captivity forged bonds as well as chains. There were moments when the system revealed its cruelty in full. If a treaty was broken, punishment fell swiftly upon those pledged as surety. Executions of hostages, though not common, did occur, and their deaths served as grim reminders of the cost of broken oaths. I once stood before a castle gate where the bodies of hostages were displayed, their fate a warning to all who might betray agreements. It was peace written in blood. Religious leaders often played a role in mediating such arrangements, believing that keeping hostages alive was both moral and pragmatic. Monasteries served as neutral ground where hostages might be held under the church's protection. Yet even there, the walls whispered of uncertainty. The prayers of monks could not erase the truth that these young souls were bargaining tools, their lives balanced upon the shifting ambitions of rulers and the fragile ink of treaties. Thus, hostages became the living currency of diplomacy in our age. They embodied both the fragility of peace and the ruthlessness of politics. Some returned home with new knowledge and strange loyalties. Others perished when promises crumbled. Their existence reminds me that even in times when the sword was sheathed, war lingered in human form, sitting quietly in foreign halls, waiting upon the decisions of kings. Few conflicts stretched so long and reshaped so much as the struggle between England and France that spanned more than a century. Captivity in this war was not merely a consequence of battle, but one of its very engines. I recall hearing accounts from weary men who had fought under banners for decades, only to find themselves bargaining their freedom with coin. The system of ransom reached its height here, transforming battlefields into marketplaces of lives. At Crécy and Poitiers, prisoners of rank were gathered in droves. The English, skilled in archery and discipline, captured swathes of French nobles who had charged headlong into their lines. Instead of slaughter, these men were carefully guarded, their names recorded, and their fates tied to negotiations that followed. It was as though victory itself had become measured in the number of valuable captives taken rather than in the bodies left upon the ground. The capture of King John II of France at Poitiers in 1356 stands as a symbol of this practice. His confinement in England was not one of chains in a dungeon but of guarded halls, where he lived as both a king and a prisoner. The ransom demanded for his release was staggering, reshaping the economy of France. To raise the sum, taxes fell upon peasants, merchants, and nobles alike. Their toil and treasure poured into the freedom of their sovereign. Even lesser nobles felt the weight of these customs. Knights captured in skirmishes along the countryside often faced years of captivity while their families scraped together payment. Villages sold livestock, guilds gathered contributions, and the burdens spread across all levels of society. I once spoke with a chronicler who said that war itself seemed less about land than about the constant circulation of wealth through the ransom of the captured. For common soldiers, however, little changed. The elaborate courtesy extended to nobles rarely reached them. Many were slain outright after defeat, their lives deemed unworthy of negotiation. Others were pressed into service by their captors, forced to fight under foreign banners until death claimed them. The great chivalric codes that chroniclers admired were, in truth, a shield that protected only the highborn, leaving the rest to vanish unrecorded. The length of the war deepened these practices. Generations grew up knowing that captivity and ransom were as much a part of combat as sword and shield. Captains accounted for ransoms in their strategies, sometimes restraining their men from killing in order to secure profit. The war itself became sustained not only by politics and ambition, but by the wealth drawn from these exchanges. It was a cycle that fed upon itself, binding men in both steel and debt. Cultural memory preserved these customs with fascination. Chronicles told of knights who treated their captors with respect and were in turn honored during captivity, reinforcing ideals of nobility even in defeat. Songs and poems praised those who returned from foreign prisons, their survival painted as testimony to courage and loyalty. Yet beneath these tales lay the truth that ransom was a burden carried by the powerless, whose sacrifices went unnoticed. In the end, the 100 Years' War revealed how captivity could shape nations as surely as battle. Kings were dethroned and restored through chains, economies shifted under the weight of ransoms, and ordinary people bore the costs of noble survival. When the war finally closed, it left not only ruined fields and broken castles, but also a legacy of captivity so entrenched that it defined the very nature of warfare in our age. When rulers themselves fell into enemy hands, the entire fabric of kingdoms trembled. The capture of a king was not simply a personal humiliation, it was a blow that rippled through courts, armies, and common fields alike. I have read and heard tales of monarchs whose crowns could not shield them from chains. To hold such a figure was to command the destiny of nations, for his ransom or captivity shaped the course of war and peace alike. One such fate befell John II of France after the Battle of Poitiers. Though treated with honor in England, his captivity drained France of resources, as taxes rose and burdens fell upon peasants already weary from war. His absence weakened the realm, and even upon his return, the scars of debt remained. His captivity proved that a king's body could be held hostage, but it was his people who paid the price. Their toil and hunger purchased his freedom. In Scotland, David II endured a similar fate after being seized at the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346. Years passed as he languished in English hands, while negotiations stretched endlessly. His captivity left his kingdom fractured, the nobles at home divided in his absence. I remember hearing that some grew accustomed to ruling without him, and his eventual release brought not unity, but further struggle. Thus, a king's captivity revealed how fragile loyalty could be. Ransom demanded for such figures was immense, often equal to the wealth of whole realms. These sums reshaped economies, forcing new taxes, reshuffling lands, and draining treasuries. The weight of silver demanded for a sovereign's release might linger for generations. For those who held the king, the wealth gained funded armies, built fortresses, and secured power for decades to come. A monarch in chains was a treasure chest far greater than any battlefield loot. Treatment of these noble captives differed greatly from that of ordinary men. Kings were not thrust into dungeons but lodged in castles, treated with deference even as their liberty was denied. They dined at guarded tables, attended by servants, their dignity preserved, though their freedom was stripped. Such courtesy, however, was a mask over the reality that they were pawns, their lives bargaining tools in the hands of their enemies. The presence of a captive monarch often altered diplomacy itself. Rival rulers saw opportunity in such weakness, forging treaties and demanding concessions impossible under normal circumstances. Borders shifted, alliances broke, and new wars began, all because one king had been bested and bound. I once heard a courtier remark that a king in chains carried more influence than a free one, for his captivity reshaped politics in ways even victory could not. For the nobility just below the crown, captivity held similar dangers. Dukes, counts, and princes, when taken, brought upheaval to their lands. Their families struggled to raise ransoms, their vassals quarreled over authority, and their absence created power vacuums that others sought to fill. A captured noble weakened not only his own house, but also the balance of power among neighboring lords, inviting chaos where stability had once stood. So it was that the captivity of rulers and nobles became a weapon more potent than any sword. To hold them was to command the fates of nations, to drain wealth, and to fracture loyalties. These men, robed in authority and crowned with power, discovered that chains clung to them as tightly as to the humblest soldier. And I, reflecting on their stories, cannot help but see how war reduced all men, king or peasant, to the same truth. To be captive is to be powerless. The memory of Agincourt lingers in my thoughts as one of the starkest examples of how fear can shape cruelty. On that October day, Henry IV of England faced a French host far larger than his own. Victory came through mud, arrows, and discipline, but what followed revealed the grim choices commanders made when pressed by circumstance. Hundreds of prisoners, many of noble blood, were cut down under orders that stunned even seasoned warriors. The decision came not from bloodlust alone, but from dread. Rumours spread that the battle was not yet secure, that French forces regrouped and might strike anew. The prisoners, though bound, were many, and Henry feared they could rise against their captors if the tide turned. In that moment, calculation overpowered chivalry, and the command was given to slay them. The very men whose lives could have yielded ransom instead became victims of necessity. I have heard chroniclers describe the scene. Knights, once spared, now struck down by the swords of their guards. It was not a massacre of peasants, but of nobles, men who under other circumstances would have been treated with courtesy and profit. Their deaths revealed the fragile nature of honor on the battlefield, how quickly ideals gave way when survival demanded harshness. The code of chivalry faltered in the mud of Agincourt. This act shook contemporaries, for the killing of noble captives was a violation of long-accepted practice. French lords mourned not only their defeat, but the loss of men whose ransom could have enriched their households. Englishmen, too, felt unease, for many had hoped to profit from the prisoners they held. Instead, they were commanded to destroy what could have been their gain. The bitterness of obedience left scars in many hearts. Yet not all prisoners met the same fate. Some of highest rank were spared, their worth too great even for fear to outweigh. Among them was the Duke of Orléans, who lived in captivity for years in England. His survival shows how even in moments of slaughter, calculation still lingered. Kings and princes could not be so easily discarded, for their lives were coins in the treasury of politics. Agincourt stands as a reminder that captivity was never secure, even for nobles. A man might surrender, expecting ransom, only to find himself condemned by circumstance. I once spoke with a veteran who said that on that field, he learned mercy was as fragile as a banner in the wind. One shift in fortune, and a captive became a corpse. That uncertainty haunted those who bore arms thereafter. The repercussions stretched far beyond the field itself. France lost not only men, but trust in the customs of war, while England's triumph was shadowed by whispers of dishonor. Some praised Henry for his ruthlessness, claiming necessity justified his command. Others condemned him for staining victory with blood. In either case, the massacre left its mark, shaping how future wars weighed fear against profit, survival against chivalry. Thus, the killings at Agincourt revealed a truth many wish to ignore, that war cares little for ideals when danger looms. Ransom, honor, and courtesy may guide men in times of calm, but in the storm of battle, survival often claims the louder voice. The mud of Agincourt bore witness to this reality, and its echoes remind us that captivity, even for the highborn, was never free from the shadow of sudden death. The clash of faith and war often found its expression in the deeds of religious orders, whose banners bore both sword and cross. The Knights Hospitaller, the Templars, and the Teutonic Knights were warriors sworn to God, yet they too dealt in captives. I recall accounts of battles where their foes were bound, some spared for ransom, others cut down when no profit could be found. In their hands, mercy and severity mingled uneasily, each act justified as service to the divine. The Hospitallers, born from the duty of tending pilgrims, became known as both healers and fighters. On Rhodes, and later Malta, they took prisoners from Muslim fleets and held them until exchanges could be made. Those of high birth were carefully guarded for ransom, while oarsmen and sailors often found themselves chained to the very galleys they once commanded. Thus, the order that began with hospitals turned captivity into a weapon of its maritime war. The Teutonic Knights, in their northern campaigns, mirrored this duality. They fought pagans in Prussia and Lithuania, capturing men to labor in castles or fields. The chronicles describe villages emptied, their inhabitants bound in chains to Christianize the land through submission. The order claimed these acts were holy, yet to those bound in servitude, it was conquest no different from any other. Faith gave reason, but chains gave reality. Even the Templars, famed for their wealth and mystery, played their part in this economy of captives. They engaged in ransom negotiations, protecting their brethren when captured, and paying dearly to redeem nobles of value. Their fortified preceptories sometimes served as holding places for prisoners awaiting exchange. In these halls, prayer and coin intertwined, salvation measured in silver as much as in scripture. Captivity under their watch was both a burden and a tool. Not all treatment was cruel. Orders occasionally released captives freely on holy days, claiming such gestures as acts of piety. These moments of clemency shone like rare stars against the darker sky of war. I once read of prisoners freed at Easter, their chains struck off in the name of Christ's resurrection. Yet even such mercy carried weight, for it reminded all that the orders held power not only to bind, but also to unbind. Still, brutality was never far. In sieges where resistance was fierce, prisoners were sometimes executed en masse, their deaths a warning to others who would defy the order's crusading might. Such actions were justified as necessary purges, framed as righteous punishment. The mingling of faith and fear made these acts all the more terrible, for they bore the aura of holy sanction, even as blood flowed freely. Negotiation often fell into the hands of clerics associated with these orders. Monks and priests carried letters, haggled over sums, and ensured that promises were sealed. Their work bridged the battlefield and the altar, turning spiritual authority into practical diplomacy. In their efforts, one sees how the church remained central, not only to salvation, but to the very commerce of captivity. Prayer and ransom became threads woven tightly together. So the religious orders, guardians of both cross and sword, shaped the fate of captives in ways as complex as the age itself. They healed and they enslaved, they ransomed and they slew, embodying the contradictions of a world where war cloaked itself in holiness. Their legacy reminds me that captivity was not only a matter of politics or greed, but also of faith wielded as both shield and chain upon the lives of men. As wars grew longer and more complex, the practice of exchanging captives became woven into the fabric of conflict. No longer was ransom the only path to freedom. Entire groups of prisoners were sometimes traded between foes. I remember reading accounts of heralds carrying lists of names across battle lines, each carefully written in ink to match man with man. Such exchanges revealed that even in an age of cruelty, there was a measure of order, a recognition that endless slaughter profited no one. These arrangements often began with nobles, whose names carried weight in negotiations. A knight taken in skirmish might be released in return for an enemy of similar rank, balancing honor with practicality. Yet as time passed, even lesser soldiers began to appear in such lists, especially when armies found themselves burdened with captives too costly to feed or guard. It was a pragmatic solution, for dead men yielded nothing, but released prisoners could serve as tokens of balance. The process itself was solemn, almost ritualistic. Captives were marched to agreed meeting points, often rivers or crossroads, where banners flew to mark the truce. I have heard tales of weary men walking in opposite directions, exchanging one captivity for another's freedom. Such moments carried a strange dignity. Enemies briefly set aside hatred, speaking words of courtesy before returning to their camps. For a heartbeat, war itself seemed to pause, as though reminded of its own futility. Clerics often served as intermediaries, their robes lending neutrality to tense negotiations. Monks and bishops carried letters, confirmed identities, and blessed the proceedings, framing the act of exchange as both practical and moral. Their presence soothed suspicions, for even the most hardened warriors hesitated to betray terms made in the sight of God. The Church's role as broker in such affairs gave these exchanges a weight beyond mere convenience. Economy played its part as well. Sometimes captives were swapped not man for man, but man for coin or goods. A group of foot soldiers might be released in return for supplies, while nobles demanded finer terms, castles restored, hostages handed over, or debts forgiven. The barter of human lives became entangled with the barter of land and treasure, until war itself resembled a marketplace where flesh and fortune mingled without shame. These exchanges also served diplomacy. When kingdoms negotiated truces, the handing over of prisoners marked both closure and proof of good faith. To see comrades returned alive gave hope to the weary, binding soldiers more tightly to their lords. I recall stories of great joy when fathers, sons, and brothers emerged from captivity, gaunt yet breathing, embraced once more by those who thought them lost. In such reunions, the harshness of war briefly softened. Still, not all exchanges ended well. There were betrayals, men promised freedom only to be slain, or agreements broken once the enemy had regained strength. Such treachery deepened hatred, teaching some to prefer execution over trust. Yet the very existence of these customs shows how even amid brutality, men sought a measure of predictability, a way to temper chaos with fragile rules. In the late Middle Ages, these exchanges became increasingly formal, recorded in charters and overseen by envoys. They foreshadowed the laws of later ages, where war would be bound by clearer codes. To look back is to see the beginnings of a shift, from sheer survival and slaughter to a recognition, however uneven, that even foes bore a claim to life. It was not mercy in the truest sense, but it was a step towards something greater than the sword alone. When a man of rank was taken, he was seldom thrown into a common pit. Instead, he found himself confined within castles, their high walls both prison and symbol. These fortresses were not merely strongholds of war, they became cages for the defeated. I remember standing before the Tower of London, its stones carrying the weight of countless captives whose lives were suspended within. To be held there was to be trapped not only by iron, but by spectacle, a reminder to all of the crown's might. Some prisoners endured their captivity in relative comfort. Nobles of wealth were often granted chambers with windows, servants to attend them, and even access to books or letters. They were not free, but their confinement was softened by privilege. A man might pace the length of a hall rather than crouch in a cell, yet the locked doors still gnawed at his spirit. Such conditions revealed how class followed a man even into captivity. Others knew only the darkness of dungeons. Beneath castles lay chambers of stone where moisture dripped and air grew foul. I once peered into such a place and saw men chained to walls, their faces pale from lack of light. Disease bred quickly, and death was often swifter than ransom. For these captives, no herald came bearing lists of names. They were forgotten beneath the earth, shadows beneath the grandeur above. Holding prisoners in castles was also a performance of power. A lord who kept a rival within his walls displayed not just might, but control over the very order of his realm. Visitors to a fortress might see the captive escorted through courtyards, a silent warning that rebellion ended in chains. The imprisonment itself became a message, a theatre where authority was demonstrated as surely as on the battlefield. In some cases, prisoners became almost part of the household. They dined with their captors, shared in hunts under watchful eyes, or even joined in feasts. Trust was never complete, but the strange familiarity blurred the lines between guest and captive. I heard once of a noble who, after years in custody, grew more at ease among his captors than among his kin. Such was the peculiar nature of imprisonment within walls meant both to contain and to host. Castles also served as places of negotiation. While prisoners waited behind their gates, letters and envoys passed through the same walls, carrying demands of ransom or concessions of land. The fortress became a center of diplomacy as much as a prison. Within those halls, treaties were born and broken, and the presence of a captive lord shaped every bargain. His silence echoed in each negotiation. His life weighed in measures of silver and parchment. Some fortresses became infamous for the captives they held. Chateau Gaillard in France, strong and proud, confined nobles whose names filled chronicles. The Tower of London grew to symbolize not only English kingship, but the captivity of its rivals. These places etched themselves into memory, their stones telling stories of ambition, betrayal, and endurance. To speak their names even now is to recall both majesty and misery. Thus, castles and fortresses stood as more than battlements of stone. They were prisons of flesh and spirit, places where nobility was humbled and where politics took form in iron locks. Behind their walls, men waited, schemed, and withered, each life shaped by the grandeur of towers above them. These strongholds preserved not only the power of rulers, but the sorrow of those who learned that even in comfort, captivity is captivity still. To speak of captivity without mention of torment would be to leave the tale unfinished. While not every prisoner suffered such fate, the shadow of torture loomed over many halls of power. I remember whispers of men stretched upon racks, their cries muffled by stone walls, forced to yield secrets that steel alone could not win. The purpose was rarely punishment alone. It was information, leverage, and control that captors sought. Chains held the body, but pain pried open the tongue. In sieges, captives were pressed for knowledge of weak points in walls or supplies hidden within. A prisoner might be beaten until he revealed where food was stored or whether reinforcements approached. Such acts were justified as necessity, cloaked in the urgency of survival. I once heard of defenders betrayed by a captive's confession, their fortress falling because one man's suffering had been twisted into speech. In these moments, agony became a weapon sharper than any blade, yet coercion took many forms beyond physical torment. Captors threatened families, promised release in return for betrayal, or dangled the hope of comfort against the misery of chains. Some prisoners were compelled to write letters urging their kin to surrender, their words penned under the eyes of their enemies. I saw how such letters bore not only ink, but despair, each stroke of the quill a silent plea for salvation. The church often condemned cruelty, yet even within holy walls, torture was not unknown. Ecclesiastical courts employed methods of their own, justified as the pursuit of truth. Captives accused of heresy or treachery endured flames and irons under the watch of men who claimed to act for God. The line between spiritual authority and earthly violence blurred, and prisoners discovered that salvation and suffering might be offered by the same hands. Noble captives fared better, though not always spared. While most were preserved for ransom, those suspected of conspiracy sometimes endured harsher measures. I heard of dukes forced into confessions through threats of mutilation, their titles offering little shield once suspicion took root. Even kings could not rest easy. A crown offered no immunity when rivals feared betrayal. The higher the rank, the greater the value of their secrets. Common soldiers, however, bore the brunt of such cruelty. With no ransom to protect them, they were seen as expendable, their lives traded for scraps of information. Many died nameless under torture, their confessions forgotten as soon as their usefulness ended. I remember how their bodies, broken and discarded, were left as warnings to others. They were sacrificed not only in battle, but in the dark chambers where silence was demanded. At times, coercion succeeded in turning captives into tools of war. A knight might betray a stronghold, a soldier reveal hidden paths, or a servant open gates in the night. Such betrayals rarely ended well for those who committed them, for once their use was exhausted, they seldom regained trust from captors or kin. I have often thought that torture claimed not only the body but the soul, leaving men estranged from both sides of the struggle. Thus, in the shadowed rooms of castles and courts, pain became a language of its own. Some spoke through it, others perished beneath it, but all who endured it were marked forever. Torture revealed the desperation of an age that sought victory at any cost, binding cruelty to strategy. And though many chronicles are silent on such deeds, I know well that behind the triumphs of war lay the muffled cries of prisoners who paid for knowledge with their flesh. As the Middle Ages ripened, the field of battle grew thick with men who fought not for loyalty, but for coin. These mercenaries, hardened by endless campaigns, bore no oaths to lord or crown. When captured, their uncertain standing shaped their fate. Some captors saw them as dishonorable, enemies without lineage or ransom, and condemned them swiftly. Others recognized their skill as valuable, sparing them to serve under new masters. Their lives rested upon the judgment of necessity. In Italy, where city-states waged constant wars, mercenaries were both essential and despised. Condottieri, those captains of fortune, led companies that sold their swords to the highest bidder. I recall tales of men captured in one campaign, only to appear months later in another, having sworn fealty to their former enemies. Captivity for them was less an end than a turning of the wheel, for gold could bind them more tightly than chains. Yet elsewhere, the contempt for mercenaries was harsher. In France and England, many were executed outright when caught, treated as outlaws rather than soldiers. Their lack of noble rank left them vulnerable, and their reputation for pillage stirred little mercy. Chroniclers wrote of companies broken not only in battle but by hangings and executions, their corpses displayed as warnings that loyalty to coin brought no honor. Fear of their lawlessness outweighed any desire for ransom. The White Company, led by Sir John Hawkwood, stands as a famous example of how mercenaries could thrive despite such peril. Captured men from his ranks were often ransomed, not for lineage, but for the fear and respect they commanded. City-states competed to claim their service, paying dearly for their release. In this way, captivity became another transaction, turning even chains into opportunities for profit. Hawkwood's men proved that reputation could be a ransom in itself. For lesser soldiers of fortune, captivity often meant enslavement. Stripped of their arms, they were pressed into labor, working fields or fortifications for their captors. Some were forced to fight in new armies, their allegiance bought not with promises, but with threats. I once heard of mercenaries in Spain who, after capture, were sent to the galleys, rowing for years under the same banners they once opposed. Their fate was fluid, like the coin they chased. The ambiguity of their standing troubled even kings. Monarchs relied on mercenaries to strengthen their armies, yet distrusted them deeply. When captured, the decision to ransom or execute carried both risk and benefit. To kill them warned others against betrayal, but to spare them risked swelling the enemy's ranks. I recall hearing of rulers who ransomed captains but slew their men, balancing pragmatism with fear. Such choices revealed the uneasy place mercenaries held in medieval war. Religion too cast its shadow. Clerics denounced mercenaries as men of greed, fighting without honor, their service seen as sin. Yet even these condemnations could not erase their necessity. Captured mercenaries sometimes found priests among their captors demanding penance alongside ransom, urging them to forsake their trade. Few heeded such counsel, for the promise of coin proved louder than sermons. Their captivity often became but a pause in lives already bound to violence. So the fate of mercenaries was as unstable as the wars they fought. They lived by the sword and often died by it, whether in open battle or beneath the rope of executioners. Captivity offered no certainty. Ransom, service, slavery, or death might await in equal measure. In them we see the contradictions of the age. Men despised yet indispensable, condemned yet courted, their chains as transient as their loyalties. Their story is a reminder that war's tools are not always honored, even as they are endlessly used. When kin turned against kin, captivity bore a weight unlike that of foreign wars. In conflicts such as the Wars of the Roses, men fought beneath banners that belonged to families once bound by blood and marriage. To capture a noble in such strife was rarely to condemn him, for his ransom or exchange might serve the same house in another season. Mercy was more common here, not from compassion alone, but from the knowledge that today's foe could be tomorrow's ally. I recall accounts of Towton and Barnet, battles that stained English fields with kinship's blood. Yet even amid such carnage, many nobles captured were preserved, their rank shielding them from the fate that befell common soldiers. They were kept alive for ransom, often lodged in castles rather than dungeons, their lives spared because their names held value. In this, civil war revealed the paradox of familiarity. Hatred fierce enough to kill, yet restraint enough to keep kin alive. The lower-born, as always, met a different fate. Common troops, when captured in civil strife, were often executed to weaken the enemy's strength. Peasants and archers received little thought for ransom, for they could not pay, nor would their lords trouble themselves for their release. Some were pressed into service under new masters, compelled to fight against those they once served. For them, civil war offered no mercy, only the same cycle of blood as in foreign campaigns. Hostages also played a key role in these struggles. Noble children were exchanged or confined in rival castles, their safety bound to the oaths of fathers and uncles. I have read of young heirs raised in households not their own, their childhood stolen by the politics of divided families. Such hostages became the currency of fragile truces, living reminders that unity rested on promises too easily broken. Their fate showed how civil war reached beyond battlefields into the very heart of homes. Some prisoners were used as bargaining chips in the contest for legitimacy. A claimant holding a rival's kin might demand recognition of his rule, or surrender of a fortress in exchange for their release. Civil war turned captivity into a political theatre, where lives became symbols of authority. I once heard of nobles paraded through towns to demonstrate power, their chains speaking louder than proclamations. Such spectacles reinforced the fragile dominance of shifting crowns. The clergy often intervened, striving to temper the worst excesses. Bishops and abbots negotiated for the release of prisoners, appealing to shared faith and kinship. Yet even their efforts faltered when ambition grew too sharp. Some captives languished for years as bargaining tools, their families impoverished by the weight of ransom. I remember a chronicle where a captive lord spent so long in confinement that his children grew to adulthood before he returned. Civil wars bound men not only in chains, but in years of absence. Unlike foreign wars, civil strife left deeper wounds in the memory of those who endured it. Captors hesitated, knowing their prisoners were neighbors, cousins, even brothers. To slay them outright was to invite shame, yet to spare them was to risk their return in renewed defiance. Every decision carried the echo of kinship, making the act of holding prisoners both practical and bitter. War within one's own land turned every choice into a reflection of loyalty and betrayal. Thus, prisoners in civil wars occupied a place both fragile and perilous. Nobles found protection through ransom and politics, while common soldiers bore the harshest punishments. Families endured separation, hostages bridged truces, and the land itself groaned under the weight of divided loyalties. The chains of such wars were not only iron but blood, binding men to a struggle where captivity mirrored the very fracture of the realm. The taking of prisoners was not only a matter of war, but of coin, shaping the wealth of kingdoms and the burden of peasants alike. Ransom payments drained treasuries, and the silver that changed hands in these transactions often rivaled the revenues of entire realms. I have seen accounts where the capture of a single noble reshaped a kingdom's finances for years, binding its people to taxes they could scarcely endure. Captivity was not just a human cost, it was an economic storm. Towns and guilds were often compelled to contribute when their lords or patrons were taken. Craftsmen who had never lifted a sword found themselves paying for wars they had not fought. Their earnings poured into the coffers of ransom. In cities like Paris and London, merchants groaned under levies meant to redeem their rulers. Their goods carried the weight of chains, for every piece of silver spent on ransom was silver denied to trade and growth. Peasants bore the heaviest share, Fields already strained by war were further emptied when taxes rose to pay for their lord's release. Families surrendered grain and livestock, leaving themselves close to starvation. I recall stories of villages where entire harvests were claimed, not for sustenance, but to free a nobleman imprisoned in some distant fortress. For the poor, captivity of their lords meant hunger in their own homes. Yet the circulation of ransom also enriched some. Captors grew wealthy beyond measure, their coffers filled with gold from foreign lands. With such wealth, castles were built, armies raised, and trade expanded. War thus became not only a struggle for power, but a business in itself, where profit came as much from captives as from conquered fields. Some lords even sought battle less for territory than for the fortune prisoners might yield. The church profited as well, for monasteries and bishoprics were often intermediaries in ransom negotiations. Fees were drawn from every transaction, and donations poured in from grateful families whose kin had been redeemed. At times, relics and treasures were pledged as surety, filling ecclesiastical treasuries with wealth derived from chains. Thus, even in captivity, the hand of the church reached deeply into the flow of silver. International trade routes felt the weight of ransom too. When vast sums left one kingdom to free a ruler, they often flowed into the treasuries of rivals, strengthening enemies even as they weakened friends. The ransom of Richard of England, for example, enriched the coffers of the emperor, shifting the balance of power across Europe. Captivity thus acted like a hidden commerce of war, redistributing wealth between kingdoms without the clash of armies. For mercenaries and minor nobles, the economy of ransom created opportunity. Some deliberately sought to capture rather than kill, knowing a living foe could buy them wealth. Captivity became a form of investment, a gamble that required patience but promised profit. I once heard a knight say he fought not for his lord's glory, but for the purse that a noble captive might bring. Such sentiments reveal how gold shaped even the edge of steel. So it was that captivity, though born of war, reached far beyond the battlefield. It impoverished peasants, enriched captors, burdened towns, and strengthened rival realms. The economy of ransom shaped medieval life as surely as markets and harvests, binding every class to its weight. Chains were not only iron, but silver, and their rattle was heard not only in dungeons but in villages, cities, and courts across Christendom. In the grim business of captivity, the voice of the clergy was often heard above the clash of arms. Priests, monks, and bishops stepped into the role of mediators, their robes shielding them where armor could not. I recall hearing of abbots who journeyed across hostile lands carrying letters sealed with both wax and prayers, entrusted with bargaining for lives. Their authority was spiritual, yet their work was steeped in silver and politics. The clergy's involvement lent sanctity to negotiations, giving them a weight that warriors alone could not provide. To betray a ransom agreement made before the church was to risk excommunication, a punishment more feared than chains. I have seen chroniclers describe kings bowing to clerical judgment, not out of piety alone, but because to defy the church was to defy the order of heaven itself. Thus the priest's presence bound men's consciences as tightly as any oath. Monasteries often served as safe havens during these transactions. Captives were sometimes held in abbeys, their ransoms arranged within cloisters where chanting monks prayed as sums were tallied. The mixture of holy ritual and worldly business revealed the dual role of the church, guardian of souls and broker of freedom. I once heard of a prisoner kept in a monastery who emerged with both his liberty and a deeper devotion, convinced his chains had been struck off by God himself. Some orders made this mission their calling. The Mercedarians and Trinitarians, founded in the 13th century, devoted themselves to ransoming captives, particularly Christians held by Muslim powers. Their friars collected arms across Europe, then travelled to North Africa or the Levant to buy back the enslaved. At times, when money ran short, they offered themselves as substitutes, enduring captivity so that others might walk free. Their sacrifice bore witness to mercy, even amid endless strife. Yet the clergy were not untouched by corruption. Some abbots grew wealthy from their role as intermediaries, drawing fees from ransoms or hoarding treasures pledged for freedom. Not all who claimed to serve God did so with clean hands. I recall one tale of a bishop accused of prolonging negotiations to enrich himself, his greed leaving captives to languish while he counted coin. Even in holy robes, men remained men, bound to weakness and temptation. The church's involvement also carried political weight. Bishops, acting as emissaries, often secured not just the release of individuals, but also truces and alliances. Their words could soften hardened warriors, turning captives into tools of diplomacy rather than casualties of war. I have read of clerics who transformed chains into opportunities for peace, showing that negotiation could achieve what the sword could not. Such deeds revealed the power of persuasion in an age ruled by steel. Clerics also offered moral justification for ransom, reminding rulers that mercy aligned with Christian virtue. Sermons were preached urging the redemption of captives, framing it as both duty and salvation. To contribute to a ransom was seen as an act of piety, earning grace in the eyes of God. Thus, the release of prisoners became not only a worldly exchange, but a spiritual transaction, binding heaven to the fate of men in chains. So it was that the clergy shaped captivity as much as knights and kings. They gave ransom its moral authority, turned negotiations into sacred duties, and sometimes risked their own lives for others. Their hands held both chalice and ledger, their words carrying the weight of scripture and silver alike. In their role, we see how even amid brutality, the voice of faith sought to bend war's cruelty toward mercy, however imperfectly. For the knight, captivity might mean a ransom and eventual return, but for the foot soldier, the story was rarely so kind. Common men taken in battle often lacked the wealth or connections to buy their freedom. Many were stripped of what little they carried, then pressed into labor or sold outright as slaves. Their worth was measured not in coin, but in sweat, their bodies traded as tools of war and toil. The treatment of these men varied greatly depending on who captured them. In some cases, victors killed prisoners outright to avoid the burden of feeding them. In others, they were marched back to castles or towns and set to work repairing fortifications, tending fields, or serving as household servants. Their captivity had no clear end, for few could expect a ransom to be paid in their name. Some lords saw opportunity in these captives, using them to replace peasants lost to famine or plague. Entire groups of prisoners were sometimes resettled on lands, their chains exchanged for ploughs. Yet this mercy was not free. It tied them to new masters as serfs, their freedom permanently lost. What had begun as war ended for them as a lifetime of unchosen servitude under foreign rule. The chroniclers often gave little notice to the fate of common soldiers, focusing their ink on kings and knights. Yet their silence does not erase the suffering endured. Behind the grand tales of ransomed nobles lay countless forgotten men who never returned home. Their absence in records mirrors their absence in villages, where families mourned without answers. Their stories, though unwritten, haunt the edges of medieval warfare. Occasionally, a soldier might find fortune in misfortune. A master impressed by loyalty or skill might grant a degree of trust, even freedom. Rare instances tell of prisoners who rose within their captor's service, valued more as allies than slaves. These cases, though exceptional, reveal how chance and character sometimes bent the iron rules of war. For most, however, hope remained a distant dream. Religious voices spoke of charity toward prisoners, but reality was often harsher. Monks might intercede, urging mercy for the poor souls in chains, yet their pleas carried less weight when no silver accompanied them. The powerful spared those whose ransom enriched them. The powerless were too often abandoned to obscurity. In this imbalance lay a stark reflection of the feudal order itself. Songs and poems occasionally remembered these men, though often as nameless figures. Ballads told of soldiers who vanished into bondage. their voices silenced in foreign lands. The art of the time painted battles in vivid color, yet left the aftermath in shadow. Their absence served as a grim reminder that the spoils of war were unevenly distributed, and freedom was a privilege of rank. Thus, the fate of the common soldier was bound more tightly to suffering than to redemption. While nobles might ride again after captivity, these men were more likely to vanish into labor, slavery, or graves left unmarked. Their story is not gilded with triumph, but etched in hardship, echoing the truth that medieval war crushed most beneath its weight, sparing only those born into power. Within the stone walls of medieval castles, prisoners often served as both workers and warnings. Their forced labor maintained the fortresses that held them, digging ditches, repairing towers, and carrying endless loads of stone and timber. Lords saw little sense in wasting bodies when they could be bent to strengthen defenses. The prisoner's sweat became mortar, binding stones that would never shelter him. Daily life for these captives was harsh and unrelenting. They rose with the first light, driven by guards into tasks too heavy for weary bodies. Food was meager, often only enough to keep them from collapse, and punishment awaited any who faltered. The grandeur of the castle, admired by nobles, was a place of unending toil for those trapped in its service. Beyond labor, their presence carried symbolic weight. Displaying prisoners in chains reminded visiting envoys and peasants alike of a lord's strength. Shackled men cleaning courtyards or tending stables were living proof of power, visible tokens of victory carved from human suffering. The very sight of them discouraged rebellion, teaching that defiance led only to humiliation. Some captives were forced into more personal duties, attending kitchens, guarding animals, or serving in households. While such work spared them from the quarry, it chained them closer to their captor's daily life. Proximity could mean scraps of privilege, but it also bred constant scrutiny. Their every gesture was measured, for any mistake might end their fragile reprieve. Castles also served as prisons in the truest sense, with dark cells carved into their depths. Damp air, iron bars, and silence shaped the fate of those locked away. The dungeons became both punishment and deterrent, feeding the fear of confinement into the hearts of those who saw them. Escape was rare, and those who tried often paid with their lives. On occasion, a captive of higher status shared space with common prisoners, but their treatment diverged sharply. A knight might have a chamber with straw bedding, while peasants slept on cold stone. This contrast sharpened the reality of rank, even in bondage. The castle mirrored the world outside its walls, where hierarchy dictated every breath. In some places, local economies quietly benefited from this arrangement. Merchants sold grain and cloth for the sustenance of captives, while craftsmen forged shackles and tools of restraint. Thus, the suffering of prisoners rippled outward, feeding not only the power of their lord, but the livelihoods of those around him. War's captives became unwilling participants in commerce. The story of prisoners in castles reveals the dual nature of those fortresses, both symbols of security and engines of oppression. To the victor, the castle was a seat of authority. To the captive, it was a cage dressed in stone. Their labor echoed in every wall and tower, a reminder that strength was built not only on conquest, but on the broken backs of the conquered. Faith guided the destiny of many who found themselves in chains during the Middle Ages. The Church held great authority, and its teachings shaped how victors treated their captives. Mercy was often preached, but it rarely outweighed the harshness of war. Monasteries sometimes intervened, pleading for the release of prisoners as acts of Christian charity. Such gestures reflected ideals, though reality often bent them. Papal decrees occasionally offered guidance on the conduct of war and imprisonment. Crusaders, for example, were urged not to slaughter fellow Christians but to hold them for ransom or exchange. This principle reinforced both piety and pragmatism. However, when religion painted an enemy as heretical or infidel, the path to forgiveness narrowed. Faith could open prison doors or seal them shut. Clergy were not absent in the treatment of captives. Priests visited dungeons, offering confession and last rites, binding the suffering to God even as chains bound their limbs. For some prisoners, these encounters brought a measure of solace. For others, they underscored the futility of resistance. Salvation of the soul mattered, even when the body rotted away. Ransoming itself carried spiritual undertones. Wealthy families and religious orders paid for the freedom of knights, framing it as an act of virtue. Charity, devotion, and familial duty mingled in the release of captives. Yet this system left poorer soldiers abandoned, their faith unable to purchase liberty. Inequality reached even into the prayers of the imprisoned. Certain prisoners found themselves drawn into service of holy institutions. Captives were put to work building churches, monasteries, or abbey fortifications. This labor was framed as penance, transforming punishment into supposed redemption. Stones laid by unwilling hands became offerings to God, though for the captives, such piety felt like another form of bondage. Religious festivals sometimes brought temporary reprieve. Lords, seeking favor from heaven, released a handful of captives during Easter or Christmas. These gestures of mercy were celebrated as demonstrations of Christian virtue, but behind them lay calculation. Generosity displayed in public burnished reputations, strengthening both spiritual and worldly authority. When faith branded a prisoner as beyond salvation, no sermon of mercy followed. Heretics, pagans, and those accused of witchcraft faced grim fates. Chains became prelude to pyres or gallows, their deaths sanctified by claims of cleansing the world of evil. In these moments, religion justified cruelty, cloaking violence in divine approval. The interplay of faith and captivity left deep marks on medieval life. For some, religion offered a fragile lifeline. For others, it delivered the final blow. Between prayers and punishments, the fate of captives hung in the balance of both mortal power and divine decree. Their stories reveal how belief could both heal and destroy within the walls of war. Looking back across the centuries, the treatment of prisoners during the Middle Ages reveals more than cruelty or mercy. It exposes the foundations of modern ideas about warfare. Practices of ransom, parole, and exchanges planted seeds that would later grow into structured codes of conduct. Although often inconsistent, these customs hinted at the beginnings of international law. The Middle Ages, with all its harshness, carried within it the faint outline of rules that endure today. The memory of these prisoners is not merely a story of suffering. Knights who endured captivity became legends, their trials woven into chronicles and ballads. Tales of noble endurance, clever escapes, and long negotiations fed the imagination of later generations. Even in chains, warriors could achieve a form of immortality through song and story. Their legacy reached beyond battlefields into the very culture of Europe. At the same time, the suffering of ordinary captives rarely reached parchment or poetry. Peasants and foot soldiers vanished into obscurity, their chains leaving no echo in chronicles. Yet their silent struggles shaped villages, families, and economies. The absence of their voices reminds us that history often glorifies the few while forgetting the many. Their unrecorded pain is part of the true inheritance of medieval conflict. Diplomatic traditions owe much to these experiences. Negotiating ransoms, exchanging captives, and arranging releases forced warring rulers to establish channels of communication. Out of these necessities grew practices that helped curb endless bloodshed. Captives became leverage, but also a bridge for dialogue. Even in an age dominated by violence, the prisoner was a strange ambassador of peace. The Church's role in shaping these customs left a lasting mark. Its insistence on mercy, however unevenly applied, contributed to the gradual humanization of war. Though far from perfect, its influence nudged rulers toward restraint. The memory of divine judgment weighed heavily on decisions, reminding lords and kings that earthly power was fleeting. In this way, faith intertwined with politics to shape the fate of the captive. Cultural expressions of captivity also left their imprint on medieval identity. Poems, chronicles, and illuminated manuscripts carried images of chained men and triumphant lords. These works were not neutral. They celebrated some, pitied others, and justified many injustices. Through art and literature, society absorbed the meanings of imprisonment, embedding them in collective memory. The stories told then still ripple into the present. Modern laws of war trace their ancestry to these medieval practices. The Geneva Conventions and codes of military justice did not appear from nothing. They evolved from centuries of trial, error, and often brutal precedent. The fact that ransom transformed into formal exchange or parole into prisoner rights speaks to this long lineage. The medieval prisoner of war, forgotten in many ways, stands as a distant ancestor to today's protections. In the end, the legacy of captivity in the Middle Ages is both a warning and a lesson. It warns of the human cost when mercy yields to vengeance, and it teaches the fragile beginnings of compassion amid brutality. By remembering both the noble and the nameless, we see how the treatment of captives reflected the heart of a civilization. Their chains may have rusted away, but their impact endures in the story of humanity.